This video will begin our overview of Chapter 9, Genres of the Old Testament, in the volume Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. To begin with, here are some background considerations. For example, what's so important about noticing the genre of a given text within Scripture? If we ignore genre, there is a risk. A risk, for example, that we might be reading a passage that's rich with imagery. By the way, that should tip us off. It's probably poetic. And if we encounter the imagery and regard it as literal, we could run roughshod over the responsible interpretation of the passage. And by the way, the reverse is true, isn't it? If we're in a piece of narrative or law and somehow we think it's just imagery, then we might discard the account or the directives that are contained there and think, well, it's just symbolic. It really doesn't apply directly to my life. Second, have you noticed how long this chapter is? It's a bit intimidating. So here's some tips concerning how to navigate this chapter. As you read through it, you will discover that there are a lot of Old Testament genres. That in itself is valuable. So just be prepared to discover there's quite a menu. One of the greatest gifts that the writers provide us within this chapter is after pretty much every genre or subgenre, they will stop and say, all right, here are the principles for interpreting this particular slice of narrative. I'm calling those interpretive keys. Watch for those and watch for trends. You'll discover as you move from one group of interpretive principles to the next that there are certain trends. Watch for those trends and try to get a sense of those. I don't know about you, but I can't remember all of these principles of interpretation. But what I can do is remember they're conveniently packed into this chapter. So dog-ear the chapter. Maybe put a note in the back of the book that says, hey, remember to come back to chapter 9 whenever I'm in a particular genre of the Old Testament, because those summarized principles of interpretation can just really set you free if you're in part of the law code, or if you're in a bit of a heroic narrative or story about a prophet. And you'll see those are some of the subgenres that we look at. Just plan to come back to this chapter as you would to a reference book in future years. All right, here are the 5 genres in the Old Testament, the major groupings that this chapter will introduce us to. Narratives, there'll be several subgenres there. Law, poetry, prophecy, and wisdom. Let's consider first the broad category of narratives. Within narratives, one of the subgenres is known as reports. You'll read about those in your textbook, and I'd like to fast forward to page 424, where we find them giving principles of interpretation for reports. So for example, their first point is we want to focus on the main subject. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Then number 2 is insightful. They acknowledge that a report tends not to provide obvious devotional content. That is, it tends not to moralize. It just says, here's what happened. But even in the way that the given writer presents the certain content of that event, reports tend to describe events that transpired in history, the filter or the lens or the selectivity employed by that writer will itself give us clues as to what the writer thinks we ought to deduce or draw from it. Similarly, point 3 indicates that reports make their points indirectly, and so the writer must ask, what is this text trying to say to me? If you're not familiar with the 1 Kings 22 example that they cite as part of point number 3 on page 424, I would encourage you to just pause, open up your Bible. This is a remarkable account. For one thing, it's rather unusual in its use of humor in order to drive home a really incisive spiritual indictment of a wicked king. So take a look at that, and as you read it, apply this principle. What's the text trying to say? You can see a suggestion on the next page. Also useful is point number 4 on page 425, where it reads, reports strung together in series. So you have, for example, the life of David. You would have several episodes. So when these are strung together, called a history, they say it's like a choir, a series of individual voices joined together to sound common themes. So we would want to read a series of reports comprising a history and say, collectively, what are these telling me about primarily how people interact with God, how people interact with each other, and are there lessons I can learn from that that will help me best live as a follower of Christ today. Next, let's look at heroic narratives and prophet stories. The interpretive principles appear on page 429. So there you see point 1. As we're encountering one of these, we should focus on the life of the main character, they tell us. Well, that seems pretty straightforward. What does that mean by implication? It means don't get lost in the weeds, in the little details and side eddies. Keep emphasizing the main point or the main character. Let that draw you into the central truths. And so they continue a sentence or two later. How does the hero's life model a relationship with God and with other people? Pretty straightforward, isn't it? By the way, sometimes the model is a negative model. Take, for example, some of the characters in the book of Judges. Some of these leaders are not worthy to emulate. And some of them are a very mixed bag. They might be doing something right, and then some other things they do, you scratch your head and say, how could someone following God do that? Well, judges weren't the only ones. Think of some of the sins committed by people like Saul or David, or some of the foolishness that wise Solomon engaged in. So we want to be discriminating as we read these. We don't want to just wholesale imitate everything they do. The writer, inspired writer, doesn't expect us to do that. He expects us to read the story and learn or embrace the places they model a wise walk with God, and then be warned for the places they went sideways or went south, as we say, in their relationship with God. I'd call your attention finally in this category to point number 4, where they write, application of these narratives should focus on analogous situations between the biblical characters and Christians today. Seems pretty straightforward, but I encourage you to read the rest of that paragraph. They make, I think, a real valuable point concerning one particular type of writing or type of story that could be misinterpreted. And then instead of the misinterpretation, the authors say, look, there's a broader, bigger principle which will be universally true, whereas the particular may not be universally true in our lives today. Take a look at point number 4 on page 429. The authors then turn to some other subgenres within narrative, such as comedy, farewell speeches. I'll commend those to you for your own reading, and pause a little bit longer for embedded genres. Page 437 is where they talk about principles for interpreting embedded genres. So as you would have learned by reading this, embedded genres are you're in the middle of some other piece of narrative, and then within it you find that there's a subgenre, and some of the ones they point out, it could be a little proverb, a little wise saying that's tucked into a larger story, or maybe a riddle For example, we've got Samson. Samson is about to get married, and he pronounces a riddle. Jotham has a riddle too, as I recall. Parables in the Old Testament, songs and lists. All right, 437. What do we do with these little pieces that don't fit the overall genre but represent a subgenre within it? Point number 2 on 437. The goal of interpretation with these embedded genres is to find what that component contributes to the message of the whole. So try to get a feel for the big picture, the larger context, then zoom in on that embedded genre and basically interrogate it, ask it, what are you contributing to this larger story? So in the case of Samson's riddle, what is this contributing to the larger story, or Jotham's little story or parable that he tells? Point number 3, this helps us dive more deeply into point number 2. So step 1, identify. On page 437, we are provided with principles of interpretation when we encounter a genre that's embedded within a larger genre. So notice briefly these steps. I think they're very wise and helpful. First, we want to acknowledge this is not the main genre, but rather it's embedded within a larger context. And so we want to, step number 2, keep in mind what is the objective of the host genre within which the embedded is located. Keep the main point ever before us. And then as we're trying to figure out what the embedded piece contributes, zero in on the embedded piece. Now I'm on 3A. Define the main point of the embedded genre. What does it say taken just on its own? Then 3B. Notice the main ideas of the host context within which it's located. 3C. Try and figure out what's the embedded piece doing in the host context. How does it relate, or what does it contribute, as they say, to the message of the whole? By walking through these simple steps, and we don't want to feel overly burdened by trying to analyze this like a doctoral dissertation, but just kind of think through them, and it'll keep you on an even keel when you're moving through one genre and you discover there's kind of a cross current, something else happening right in the middle of it. All right, now we're ready for the next major genre within the Old Testament, which is law. From the outset, we want to be aware of 2 classifications of law that have become typical distinctions as people are talking about the directives that are found in the Old Testament. The first is called casuistic law. Casuistic law. This is case law. And the simple way to remember this, what helps me, is to think, okay, in this case, what am I supposed to do? In this circumstance, what am I supposed to do? Often they are expressed as, if such and such happens, then respond by thus and so. And you see that example in the Exodus 21:28 before you. The second, the alternative type of law, instead of case law in a given instance, the second type is unconditional law. Sometimes you'll find it's described as apodictic. Case law, or casuistic, over against apodictic, which is unconditional law. That means it's not there's not going to be a restrictive condition that must be met, like an ox that gets out and then injures people. But here is a prohibition or a directive that applies universally, as, for example, monotheism, not giving worship to any gods other than the God of Israel. Here, perhaps it would be helpful to turn this into a case law, and you'll see the distinctive. What if it read, on Tuesday, like if today is Tuesday, don't worship any other gods besides me? That strikes me as kind of ludicrous or humorous, right? What point would that be? So it's universal. It's unconditional. Regardless of the day of the week, regardless of the time of day, you're never supposed to be worshiping any other gods besides the God of Israel. That's an unconditional or an apodictic law. All right, let's think about how to interpret the law. First, a couple of background observations. It probably seems transparent, but let's realize that the law codes of the Old Testament were not comprehensive. They did not account for every single situation that an Israelite might find him or herself in. Fair enough. The next one is really, really important, I believe, important to me, and I hope you'll consider it carefully. Isn't there not the tendency when we come across a list of do's and don'ts in the Old Testament to think, my goodness, oh, why was that needed? Okay, that other one, I can see the point of that, but this one, wow, what's God thinking here? All right, so that can be an honest reaction. And as a result, we might simplistically say, wow, these are kind of idiosyncratic. It's like almost as if God woke up one day and said, I'm going to have to make a few rules down there, so let's just kind of put some things in a basket, and here they come out. All right, instead of that view, admittedly pretty casual and a little humorous, but too much reality to it sometimes as far as our interpretation or assessment, I've been increasingly convinced of two things that you see in the next point. Number one, the law codes were a gift. The law codes were a gift. Isn't there a place where Moses says to his fellow countrymen, he says, my, what people is there on earth who is so fortunate as us to have the law that God has given us? I believe that's early in Deuteronomy. Could be wrong on that. But notice his attitude towards the law. We are so fortunate. Here's another place where this point is driven home with just rich clarity. It's Psalm 119. Psalm 119, that is all about God's instructions to us. And the poet of Psalm 119 does not say, oh boy, God just kind of willy-nilly hatched up all these do's and don'ts, and I sure wish he hadn't because it makes life tough. Quite the opposite. If you haven't read Psalm 119 recently, and I would encourage reading it in a fairly fresh translation, I'm finding fresh translations just make this so vividly rich. The sense you get from the poet of Psalm 119 is, I can't believe how good God has been to give us these instructions. I just love them. So it's almost like he says, I can't get enough of these. I love your law. I'm so burdened and resentful of your directives. Well, why would he say that? I think it has to do with what I've suggested in italics here. The law was not an end to itself, but a facilitator of relationship, maintaining this incredibly fortunate, blessed opportunity of being in connection with the creator of the universe. And so, given that incredible invitation, relationship with the God of the universe, the law is how to run that thing, how to make sure it doesn't break down. If it breaks down, how to fix it. Thinking about the sacrificial systems, they are the ones that are for atonement, right? So think of the law in that respect. One of the letters of John, remember 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, one of the statements that he makes, he says that God's law is not a burden. Not a burden. No, it's a gift.